morning and welcome everyone. My name is Geraldine Singer and I am the chair of the Conservation and Natural Resources Advisory Council, also known as CNRAC. As we get started, I would like to mention that today's session is being recorded and will be available in the near future on DCNR's website under CNRAC. When DCNR was established in 1995, CNRAC was as well and serves as an advisory council to the department. Part of our work is to gather input from interest groups and the public in an effort to help DCNR further their mission, which is to conserve and sustain Pennsylvania's natural resources for present and future generations' use and enjoyment. CNRAC Conversations came to life as a result of COVID and was kicked off in the spring of 2021 with our first CNRAC Conversations focusing on diversity in the outdoors. This virtual format has been a great way to reach many more people joining in our dialogue and sharing of information. Today's event is a result of the efforts of two CNRAC work groups, Infrastructure and Communications and Outreach. Many thanks to them for their work and input. In addition to the work groups, I would also like to thank DCNR staff who were instrumental in helping us make this happen. Gretchen Leslie, Senior Advisor to the Secretary, Katrina Harris, CNRAC Administrator, and Era Vinch, our behind-the-scenes person keeping us all connected today. Good job, Era. Back in the fall, literally 6 months ago today, we held CNRAC Conversations, Economics and the Outdoors, Part 1, and had a great discussion with economic development, tourism, and recreation leaders around the why the outdoors is so important to the Commonwealth's economy and our quality of life. Today's CNRAC Conversations, Economics and the Outdoors, Part 2, we want to take that discussion a step further and discuss the how the case can be made for investment in the outdoors, discussing state and local needs and opportunities, understanding the funding streams available for recreation and conservation, and sharing what is happening with funding on the state level. And to help make that all happen, we have a great panel of speakers joining us today. Today we have Becky Bradley, the Executive Director of the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission, Marcy Mowry, President, Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation, Tim Hurd, CEO of the Pennsylvania Recreation and Parks Society, Silas Chamberlain, Vice President of Economic and Community Development for the York County Economic Alliance, Bradley Barkdahl, Advocacy Manager for We Conserve PA. And serving as our moderator for the day is Nathan Rigner, who recently joined DCNR in December as the state's first Director of Outdoor Recreation. Thank you, Nathan, as well for all your efforts and for moderating our wonderful panel of speakers today.
My pleasure, Geraldine. Thank you very much for getting us kicked off. Thank you to CNRAC for hosting the conversation. To our panelists for participating, and to all who are joining us. As we begin, I'd like to share just a few remarks about the reason why we're having this conversation, the significance of outdoors and its connection to economics, and then we'll go over just a brief overview of what we can expect in our panel today, and we'll get rolling. So. With that, why are we having this conversation? Well, quite frankly, because the outdoors are essential. Secretary Dunn often makes the point that our experience during the COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated this. At the height of the pandemic, when we were all locked down at home for our own safety, there were three things that most of us found essential in our lives. One was going to the grocery store for food. Two was going to the pharmacy for our medication, and three was going outdoors for our health, for our recreation. And so that's an illustration of how essential the outdoors are. They're essential for our physical health, for cardiovascular, musculoskeletal health, for chronic disease prevention, Being outside, having outdoor assets close to our homes are essential for our mental health and well-being, as well as for our social health and our community health. And I'm talking about population, public health kinds of concepts here. I'm also talking about uh, social integration, addressing loneliness, feeling like we're a member of a community. Outdoor spaces are places where we can gather together and join as communities. So they're essential. The outdoors is essential to Pennsylvanians as individuals and as communities. It's also essential to our economy. Outdoor recreation specifically, which is only one part, one line of the conversation that we're having today. Outdoor recreation specifically adds $12 billion annually to Pennsylvania's GDP. That's 1.5% of our economy. And with an economy as large and diversified as Pennsylvania's is, that 1.5% is absolutely significant. It is, in fact, larger than the contribution of agriculture, forestry, mining, quarrying, oil, and gas extraction combined to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Provides for about 150,000 direct full-time jobs. And so the outdoors has an incredible generative component for our economy. It's also a way that the outdoors also contributes to the efficiency of our economy. Spending time outdoors helps us save on our healthcare costs, our utility costs, and in fact, it is outdoor infrastructure that helps us realize some of these savings. And so when we're talking about outdoor infrastructure, we're talking about things like riparian buffers and wildlife corridors, what we often talk about as green infrastructure. This green infrastructure provides for stormwater management, temperature regulation, helps us deal with the disturbances and extreme weather that we know are becoming more and more common, and for which our traditional gray infrastructure, if you will, is often ill-equipped to handle or will be expensive to develop. It addresses green infrastructure, can help us address carbon sequestration issues, and gives us the kinds of ecosystem services, water and air purification, for example, that we know we need as individuals and that our economy needs to thrive. The outdoors not only provides those sorts of ecosystem services, but it also provides direct services for our communities. Services that we're coming to realize are key to the development and vibrance of our community. Here's a chart. If any of you are into quantitative data, you might like this. All credit goes to our panelist, Silas Chamberlain, who sent this study along to us at DCNR. I'm going to spend just a minute talking through this because I think it's very powerful. So this chart is one out of a study from the Brookings Institution that looked at the drivers of prosperity for small and medium-sized rural and industrial communities in the Midwest. And when Silas sent this to us, he said, do a find and replace on Midwest with Pennsylvania, and you've got your story there. And I believe that that is absolutely true. So we have two charts here. On the x-axis of each of these charts is quality of life, measured from worse on the left to better on the right. Quality of life in this study was measured through a combination of wages and real estate costs. On our y-axis, in the left-hand chart, we have population growth. So is the population of a community growing towards the upper end of the axis or decreasing on the lower end of the axis? And in the chart on the right, it's the same thing for employment growth. Are there more jobs with more people in them or fewer jobs with fewer people in them? And what we see in these two charts, within about 250, again, small and medium-sized rural and industrial communities in the Midwest, as quality of life in these communities increased, their populations grew, and the percent of that population who was employed grew. when asked, when the residents and business owners in these communities were asked, so what do you mean by quality of life? They said, well, the things that make quality of life high for us are easy access to high quality outdoor recreation, preserved heritage in our downtowns, and contemporary cultural services occupying those heritage spaces in our downtowns. And so this is what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about how outdoor recreation and its connection to heritage in our communities in Pennsylvania can really help drive the development and economic prosperity of our communities into the future. So, with this big picture overview, I would like to join Geraldine in welcoming our panel today. We're going to go through a progression. Each of our panelists is going to have an opportunity to share some remarks with us. They've each been allotted about 7 minutes to do that. That was my message to share with you panelists. We'll follow that up with a discussion period. During that discussion period, we encourage all participants to pose their questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Towards the end of the panel, after we've had some discussion, we want to give each panelist an opportunity, approximately 2 minutes, to make a closing statement, to make sure that you leave our group today with the key message that you would like to deliver. And then we'll thank the panel and wish everybody a good day. So with that, I'd like to welcome Becky to the virtual podium, so to speak. And Becky's going to talk with us about the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission's return on environment study and the way that study has led to ongoing work in the valley to help realize the benefits of natural capital and build those into the economic planning and activities that are occurring over in her part of the Commonwealth. So Becky, please take it away.
Thank you very much. And I'm really actually a little too excited probably to be here today. And I really appreciate the introduction, Nathan, because it really exemplifies everything that we're trying to do in the Lehigh Valley, which is Lehigh and Northampton counties. So the Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton area in Eastern Pennsylvania. So one of our core principles, and this is very important, especially the conversation related to return on the environment, is you've got to begin with fact-based optimism. And so just to kind of let you know what's happening here, the Lehigh Valley's population has been growing steadily since the 1960s. And we have now over 687,000 people. And if we continue on the same growth projection, we're going to go over 800,000 people in the next 20 years. Simultaneously, that means more development, and that's really what this slide shows. Just by way of volume, we reviewed almost 500 development plans alone last year. We're a bi-county planning agency as well as a metropolitan planning agency for transportation, planning and investment. So we serve a dual role. And really, we've been in the growth management business for now 61 years. But we really operate on a philosophy that if we want to achieve all of these great outcomes that we've set out for ourselves, planning has to be transformational, not just transactional. And so that requires us to find regional solutions to sometimes global challenges. In the case of climate action, that certainly is the case. So how did we get started on this return on environment business? And what are those facts that help support our quality of life? Well, we got started back in the early teens, 2010s, with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as part of their now concluded Sustainable Communities Initiative. And we developed a very large partnership with, I believe, about 17 entities at the end of the day to work on issues of integrating the economy, the environment, transportation, and then livable communities. And that culminated in this One Lehigh Valley effort, which resulted in 31 new goals for the Lehigh Valley. One of the initiatives under that Sustainable Communities Initiative was the Lehigh Valley Return on Environment. We knew if we wanted to prioritize the environment that we had to have some real numbers around it. So we started asking ourselves around 2014, what was missing, and how could we support some of these broader goals? So our objective was to document the current state of the Lehigh Valley's environment and then quantify monetary values around natural system services, whether that be floodplains, wetlands, those sorts of things, our open space, outdoor recreation, how many people were participating, how much money were they spending, what did that mean for our economy, how we can improve our air quality and reduce our healthcare costs, and then how could our property values, or are our property values, increase due to proximity to parks, rec, and open space facilities. And I'm not going to go through all of these details, but just read them fairly quickly. This is just 2 counties, by the way. So in terms of natural system services, green infrastructure, and Nathan had mentioned the importance of that in his opening remarks, along streams, reduce tax dollars by avoiding more than $110 million in annual expenditures related to water supply, flood mitigation, and water quality. But overall, the natural system services to open space provided an estimated value of over $355 million a year in just Lehigh and Northampton counties. We had a similar story on air quality. We really focused on the value of what our forested lands provided in terms of air quality benefits. We all know animal migratory benefits and those sorts of things of connected forest lands. But at the end of the day, we aren't always talking about air quality benefits. But at that, what we figured out was that we could avoid healthcare costs and damage to agriculture, buildings, and other things at $54 million per year by then enhancing things that supported good quality air. In terms of outdoor recreation, we found out how many people were actually participating. Now, remember, this is pre-pandemic, so you already have an exceptionally high number of people participating in outdoor recreational activities in our region. And then working with partners like the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, the DNL, National Heritage Corridor and Wildlands Conservancy, we were able to really hone in on the value of that. And what we found out was outdoor recreation spending and the total impact of that was estimated at almost $800 million a year annually. And then in terms of property values, and this one is one that I would recommend anybody who is interested in doing a return on investment effort keep in. It's really critical to dealing with the development, banking, and economic development community, your Chamber of Commerce and other folks, is tell them what the value is to themselves if they protect all of these things that many of us hold sacred, and a lot of us on this call think about every day, but not everyone else does. So what we found out was the average real estate premium for just a single family home within a quarter mile of protected open space was at least $2,600 in a rural location, because you tend to be more surrounded by open space there. So even if you're living in a rural area, there's an added value to your property. But it was highest for homes in the cities, our boroughs, and suburban communities. And the added value to your home could be almost $29,000 by just being within a quarter mile of protected open space. So we went out along with our Lehigh Valley Greenways Conservation Landscape Partners, and that's a really wonderful program that DCNR has had for years. We had an active group for a little over, I think, 20 years almost at this point. We went out and worked with our partners through that initiative to make signs and put them in parks, along trails, random locations where people would see the facts associated with the return on environment, to build that dialogue and that local knowledge of the value of the space that they were in to them, to our environment, to our future. We then, after about a year, did a public survey to ask people what their priorities were for the region, and found out that natural resources came up at the top of the list with over 95% of over 8,000 responses in our region saying that it was important or very important. And then that tied into other priorities that you could see on the screen. We then took this starting in late 2017, but really 2018 and 2019, and use this as a platform to talk about how we could merge our almost $500 million transportation planning and investment program with our global comprehensive planning goals into a single document called Future LV, the regional plan, which was adopted at the end of 2019. So what we did was we rolled in all of these concepts, starting with that fact-based optimism that came out of the return on environment. And I'm going to run through these super fast to show you how we actually illustrated in the plan using real locations in the Lehigh Valley where we could actually achieve these broader goals to maintain and improve our air quality, provide access, between a seamless integration between the transportation system, our trails, parks, and recreation facilities. In fact, we designated some of our trails in the regional plan as official commuter corridors. They're safer locations, and they're also existing ways and ways where we could enhance a little bit more and reinforce those facilities with investments to really look at them as part of the transportation picture. But we took real places in the Lehigh Valley and we photoshopped in how we could take all those policies and goals and objectives that we developed from Future LV and put them into a real place. Another thing I would just say that everyone needs to do if they're working on a comprehensive plan, whether it's a local comprehensive plan, a multi-municipal, or a county plan, or in our case, a bi-county plan, is tell people what this looks like. Don't just tell them protect the environment, tell them how to do it. So we looked at different types of communities, used that to support our transit system and the growth of that into a bus rapid transit network. We looked at suburban type communities and how to reinforce that, how to utilize the existing infrastructure of the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor into a green infrastructure stormwater management piece that also protected people's health. Working with the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design in their landscape architecture program, we figured out how to look at our industrial areas and green those up and create parks and recreation trail facilities that would help then start to reduce some of the air quality impacts of that. We also looked at how our highway network and where existing green space exists today, how that was interconnected to support things like animal migration, but to also support better stormwater management, more natural investment overall, and how we could partner those hard infrastructure investments with the green infrastructure investments to then reduce carbon into the atmosphere. We looked at those places that you don't really want to talk about, but you have to go to. We know that in-store shopping is declining, was declining prior to the pandemic. Pandemic has only accelerated that. So how can we actually redevelop those facilities, connect them using a sidewalk network that in some cases doesn't exist at infrastructure, and connect them to things like the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor Trail? How could you green up suburban locations, create new recreational facilities that connected them to other places as well as internally to those sites? And then we definitely didn't want to ignore our rural areas and how they connect to open spaces such as the Appalachian Trail or other parks and recreation facilities like Jacobsburg State Park. We worked very heavily in our equity communities as well, and in prioritizing investment in green infrastructure and multimodal transportation systems in those locations. So at the end of the day, one of our next philosophies was, in order to be shovel worthy, you have to be people worthy, environment worthy, and future worthy. And I'm about to wrap up here. We're in the process of updating our new long transportation improvement program, which is that new federal infrastructure funds that come to PennDOT and then down to the regions. We're investing over $80 million in our transit system, and then more millions into interconnectivity between the road network and our trail system. We just put $1.4 million out on the street to close key trail gaps and to improve the mobility in our park system. And I'll end on this. After a 6-year-long process, we were able to secure over $21 million from the U.S. Department of Transportation in a RAISE grant to help close the largest gap in the DNL trail system in the poorest and least equitable community in the Lehigh Valley, to improve those equity metrics, improve their health metrics, and close a major gap in the 165-mile Envision system of the DNL. That was a major multi-sector partnership. And I would encourage everyone to utilize their economic information and their value of their natural system services and their parks and recreation facilities to talk to your business community. In order to apply to get that $21 million, we had to raise a $34.4 million match. We were able to convince the development community, along with a couple local government partners, DNL, Wildlands Conservancy, and others, but really the development community fronted that $34 million match. So you can convince folks to come into larger economic green partnerships. And I encourage everyone to do that. We are going to achieve this as a result of that funding, to move from that urban environment to the more natural environment just north of that. And I'm just so excited that that fact-based optimism through return on environment was able to allow us to build that knowledge base and that conversation to start to allow us to make better investments and achieve the things that we've all been dreaming about. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. There's a number of follow-up questions I have. We'll get to them during the discussion period. It's clear you've been doing a lot of work there in the Lehigh Valley. And there's a lot of work to be done elsewhere in the state as well. Our next speaker, Marcy Mowry, is going to be talking to us from the Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation about their work to document the infrastructure needs on our state lands and how those connect to the economics of outdoors. Marcy, please.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. And thank you, Becky. That was really good information, and I can't wait to utilize that in some of the talks that we do about how important it is to invest in our public lands. The Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation is the nonprofit partner for the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. And in 2019, we released a study looking at the infrastructure needs in our state parks and state forest. Oftentimes when we visit a park or forest, we have a very enjoyable experience because the staff in these places are amazing. They know that when we're visiting a park or a forest, we're there on vacation, and they really want to make sure that we have a quality time or a quality experience. Yet behind the scenes, there are a lot of infrastructure that is deteriorating. And when we released our study in 2019 and we had gathered data in 2018, there was over $1 billion need for maintenance and infrastructure in our state parks and state forests. Last year, we went back and we looked at those numbers again, and it has risen to over $1.4 billion. And what we're talking about are roads, bridges, water and sewage treatment facilities. Interestingly, DCNR manages land that is equal to about twice the size of the entire state of Delaware. So that's a lot of infrastructure. So 2.3 million acres, 121 state parks, 20 forest districts, over 4,800 buildings, miles of roads, trails, dams, bridges, sewage treatment plants, and water treatment plants. A lot of the things that you don't think about when you visit a park or forest, but are necessary for a quality experience. We can advance. In addition, there are lots of other recreational facilities and amenities that they manage, including campsites, picnic tables. That's a question I often ask people. How many picnic tables do you think there are in our state parks? There's over 30,000 picnic tables, which is kind of hard to get your head around. Shooting ranges, boat ramps, swimming beaches, all of these pieces of infrastructure need maintenance. It wears out over time. Safety regulations change, wear and tear, and things are aging. So if we can move on. For example, bridges. There's over 864, 17% of DCNR's 864 bridges are structurally deficient. And what that means is that they might not be able to accommodate the weight at which they were initially built. The average life expectancy of a bridge is 50 years. The average age of a bridge is over 62 years. And I was visiting a park and they had a weight restricted bridge, which might not seem like a lot. Okay, so now it's from 5,000 ton down to 4,000 ton. Well, the ambulance could no longer access the beach via the quickest route. So if there was an emergency at that beach, the ambulance had to go around and walk down in. A bridge might be a conveyance to a local home in the area, or so a bus may have to be rerouted for your children going to school, or perhaps an emergency vehicle can no longer get to a building. So our bridges are very important and they're deteriorating and we need to replace them or upgrade them to accommodate the types of vehicles that we use today. High hazard dams are another thing. There are 47 high hazard dams in the state park and forest system. These are dams that if they were to fail, could impact life or cause property damage downstream. Now, we don't need to run screaming into the streets. They're sound, but there are things that we need to look at for the long term because we've had more and more unusual rain occurrences. And that's putting a lot of pressure on these dams across the system. Can advance. We often don't think about wastewater and water treatment. And in fact, DCNR has 70 sewage treatment plants and 172 public water supplies. Some of these sewage treatment plants also treat water for local municipalities. And I was visiting another park this summer where they had just done some work on their dam. The park was great. The sewage treatment plant went out. And so there it was very hot, but you couldn't use the facilities because there was no sewage to accommodate it. Some of our plants are actually celebrating their 50th anniversary. So what happens is they're spending money and a lot of time to create parts, to remake repairs to facilities that are antiquated. And we really need to update these because if a sewage plant goes out or a public water supply or the pipes that I showed in the beginning were to leak, not only would it impact a visitor experience, it could cause water quality damage in the surrounding surface and groundwater. I mentioned that there are 4,876 buildings that DCNR manages. 40% of these buildings are in poor state of repair. And if you could advance to the next slide, I think that really illustrates the fact that there were several times within the history of our parks and forests where there were intensive building phases. One of those was during the Civilian Conservation Corps, and one was during the era we know as the Goddard era. So during the 1930s and then from 1955 and 1970. So all of these buildings, all of these structures are coming of age at the same time, which means that if you own multiple buildings or you have several cars that are the same age, they're all coming into the same needs potentially at the same time. And if you don't replace a roof, you may be replacing the ceiling and the furniture. If you don't repair the lean-to or the chimney, you may no longer be able to use that facility for a picnic area or for an overnight stay. So we can remove. And we can't forget about the natural infrastructure. I think Nathan mentioned riparian buffers. We have a lot of natural infrastructure. We've had a lot of pressures. Spotted lanternflies are most recent, but the hemlock woolly adelgid, the emerald ash borer that caused the loss of a lot of our ash trees. So DCNR manages this natural infrastructure. And in fact, in our forest, a large part of the need is to treat abandoned mine drainage and to plug abandoned, orphaned shallow gas wells. So that natural infrastructure is an important part of the experience, but also is an important part of that return on the investment that Becky was talking about. So you're going to hear a speaker later talk about some of the initiatives that are out there to try to find some funding to address these needs. But in advance of that, I want to share with you a poll that we recently had commissioned from the Susquehanna Polling and Research, where they contacted voters, people who have a history of voting, to ask them several questions. And one of the questions was, knowing that our legislators have to prioritize how money is spent, and knowing that if money is put towards maintenance and infrastructure in our parks and forests, that there would be less money for other projects. Do you or do you not consider this a priority? And 2/3, 66% of likely Pennsylvania voters agree that state lawmakers should place a high priority on funding for state parks and state forests. And if you can advance. The second question that we asked related to the American Rescue Plan funding. And there is some money still available in that could be invested into state parks and state forests, community parks, land acquisition. And again, we made it very clear that if money were to go toward these expenses, there would be less money for other potential opportunities for the American Rescue Plan funding. And 2/3, 67% of likely PA voters support using as much as $125 million of the state's share of the federal American Rescue Plan's funding on the maintenance and repair of state parks and state forest. And our last question related to the important role that forests play. And I found it interesting that Becky was talking about that they took this information about the role, the return on the investment of our natural assets, and they educated the population, and the population said, yeah, these are important. Well, we did the same thing with this question. We explained that our forests act as filtration for water. They help to clean our water, and they help to reduce flooding, and asked if they felt that the state should be doing more to protect these forested ecosystems and to expand them. And 79% of likely voters agree the state should do more to invest in state forests to protect clean water and to reduce flooding. So I know that I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I just wanted to point out that I like to talk about our state parks and state forests as being the goose that's laying the golden egg. And if we don't start investing in the goose, that golden egg, all those returns on the investment, those outdoor recreation opportunities that support the jobs across the Commonwealth, and that are 1.5% of our economic world, for lack of a better word at the moment, we're going to lose that. So we find it's very important that we work together, and then we talk about how investing in our parks and forests can benefit everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the mute check. And thank you very much for your comments. You know that I'm one for metaphors, and I love that goose and golden egg one. It takes me right back to my childhood. Having heard a perspective on state parks and forests from Marcy, we're now going to turn our attention over to Tim, who's going to share some similar perspectives with respect to local park and outdoor needs in the Commonwealth. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you and good morning. The Pennsylvania Recreation and Park Society is the principal statewide association providing industry leadership, professional development, advocacy, and resources for those working and volunteering in the parks and recreation field. Now, Pennsylvania boasts more than 6,200 local parks, totaling some 195,000 acres, the majority of which are owned and managed by local municipalities. The state's natural assets are also connected via more than 12,000 miles of trails. So with this slide, we're inserting some important links into the record that you can come back and check out a little bit later, but there is an interactive map of local and state parks, a similar map of all the trails throughout the state. We put in the link to the state outdoor recreation plan, as well as the link to the statewide marketing and branding campaign for Pennsylvania parks and recreation called Good for You, Good for All, and the PRPS website. And I'd also like to point out that each third Friday of July is when we celebrate Park and Recreation Professionals Day by honoring all those who work behind the scenes for our public good. And you can find more about that on the PRPS website. Well, many of the stewardship needs of the local parks and trails are not significantly different than their counterparts under other jurisdictions, perhaps except in size or scope. I like to borrow the biological phrases and terminology. If we don't maintain our parks, they may become threatened or endangered of extinction. If that roof is not replaced and you lose the safety, you may have to shut that resource down to public use. Well, most park users don't really care who owns it. If it's nearby, to them, it's a so-called local park. What they do care about is that it must be clean, safe, and ready to use. And that's where the funding concerns enter, regardless of who owns the resource. Just days ago, on April 19th, Governor Wolf signed Act 15 into law, which allows municipal governments to use up to 25% of their open space funds for maintenance, regardless of how the land was acquired. This pragmatic change in the law will provide for better maintenance and therefore higher quality of local park and recreational resources. But funding of parks and outdoor recreation is only one part of the economics equation. Land and water conservation projects return $7 to the Pennsylvania economy for each dollar invested in infrastructure, acquisition, upgrades, and maintenance, or in further developing the connections between people and nature and commerce. So parks and trails keep people healthy and boost the local economies. And our residents are putting their own investments into connecting with those assets, as is seen in this infographic from DCNR. There doesn't seem to be a really good argument against investing in our parks and trails. Popular support is both broad and deep, agrees with the figures presented by Marcy and Becky. 4 out of 5 people agree that local parks are worth the tax dollars spent on them. Well, PRPS recently partnered with Penn State University to better understand local officials' perceptions of parks and recreation and the factors that influence their funding allocation decisions. This latest survey looked at local officials' priorities and support for parks and recreation through the COVID era and was conducted with the aid of our various municipal associations. The survey topics included funding allocation scenarios, the importance of and the performance in addressing community issues, tax revenues and costs related to park and rec budgets, the essential and important nature of parks and recreation during COVID, and the pursuit and use of federal relief funds for parks and recreation. To highlight a few of the findings as a sampler for us, this slide shows where parks and recreation fit in on the level of importance among 9 local government services as ranked by the local officials. And we fall in about the middle between transportation and housing and community development. Now that in itself is an improvement from about 15 years ago when we were sharing that lowest berth there with libraries. But this is one of the very interesting parts from this survey. The tax-based funding trends for parks and recreation in Pennsylvania has largely remained the same, with about 20% of the agencies increasing and a little fewer declining. But when we look at the operational cost trends, we see a growing deficit in their funding needs just to function at the same level. On the perceived significance and performance of those 9 community issues, it's also very interesting to see that the contribution of parks and recreation to those issues are perceived very nearly their equal. And in the cases of community and health and real estate, even greater. The survey showed that while the use and appreciation and the support of Parks and Recreation is very positive, it's also relative to community priorities and other community services. The contributions to local community issues, park and recreation program attendance, vocal community advocacy, and a positive relationship between the local officials and the park and rec directors. But if we skip to the bottom line among the predictors of budget allocations, we'll move the slide ahead. The Parks and Recreation tend to realize the largest increase in expenditures in a fiscal surplus scenario, but they're also the most severely cut in a fiscal deficit scenario. So while this confirms that both the need for greater funding and the justification for its investment to grow the local economy is valid, we still have more work to do in making the relevant connections between the planners, the outfitters, the local businesses, the park stewards, recreation providers, and the fiscal decision makers for our local parks and trails. I want to thank Dr. Andy Moen and his Penn State team of researchers for the data and some of the slides I've just shared. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think data is always a very powerful way to illustrate the needs and benefits of these, particularly at the local level, where people can combine both the stories and the connections that they have with their communities with the numbers that come out of studies like that. Our next speaker is Silas Chamberlain from York, who's doing good work at the local and state levels around helping to connect municipalities and regions with resources to satisfy some of these needs in outdoor recreation. Silas, we welcome you to share your thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. And thanks everybody for being part of the panel today. The speakers before me have said very well the connection between the economy and outdoor infrastructure. And so I'm going to hammer home some of those points, but also talk about how you can access funding to actually make some of these investments within your community and at the regional level as well. So next slide, please. You've heard from Nathan, from Becky, from Tim about this connection between the assets that we have across Pennsylvania and the connection that they have to small businesses and economic development. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that this is part of a bigger paradigm shift that we've seen in the past several in particular, but really for the last decade or so, as that divide between the economy and conservation and outdoor recreation really has come to mean less and less, because more and more people have started to see investments in outdoor recreation as investments in our economy. The pandemic itself really helped with that paradigm shift, in that place-based assets, such as all of those we've been talking about, parks, trails, open space, really proved essential at a time when we were really going through, in Pennsylvania and the nation, a period of focusing on what was essential in our communities and where people could turn when the economy was in turmoil and when public health questions were at the top of everyone's mind. And it really was our parks and open space, our trails, our walkable downtowns, our historic sites that were there for us and really sustained local economies through driving visitation in the outdoors when other parts of our economy were shut down. In terms of how economic developers look at this work, we are also changing our minds in a lot of ways. And obviously I work with folks who care a lot about how many square feet of development we see every year, how many jobs we've created. But we did a survey a couple years ago of every economic development official in Pennsylvania. and got pretty good participation and found that 88% of economic developers see the outdoors and investment in outdoor infrastructure as part of their economic development strategy. So you have advocates in your community who talk a lot about economic development, who are very open to hearing a message about investing in the outdoors as part of their strategy. And that's true across Pennsylvania. And one of the reasons why economic developers are looking at it this way is that, as Nathan really opened with, talent attraction and competing for businesses and talent is really the next economic development issue that's emerging. There was a time when the conversation was really driven by transportation, which is still important, tax structure, which is still important. But increasingly, it really is about quality of place, because quality of place will attract talent to a region. And so you have organizations like the National Realtors Association saying that access to walking and bike paths is really how people determine where they're going to live. You even hear from corporate executives who are tasked with finding the next location for their business, ranking quality of life amenities such as trails and parks right up there with energy costs and market access and corporate tax rate. So this idea of the outdoors as a driver of the economy is really becoming embedded in the work that we do. And the final piece of this paradigm shift is really looking at equity as well, and being able to chart the investments in outdoor infrastructure as they line up with in trying to transform some of the inequities in our economies. And Becky talked about the Lehigh waterfront project there in Allentown that checks that box as well. And you can see in the little image at the bottom of the right that if we take some of the tools that are available to us through DCNR that look at the access that communities have to open space and parks and trails and map them against areas of persistent poverty and low to moderate income census tracts in Pennsylvania, that the places that need access to the outdoors the most and are most in need of investment in outdoor recreation infrastructure are also those that are struggling the most economically. And so there's this great opportunity to even more closely align our interest in the outdoors and our interest in economics for the benefit of all people. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus very, very quickly, because each one of these could be their own presentation, on the fact that there are opportunities both at the local and the state level and even the federal level to tap into some funding. And it'll really be the communities and the regions that are able to align their outdoor recreation needs with economic development and revitalization strategies who are going to be best positioned to take advantage of the American Rescue Plan Act, funding from our state agencies, and some of the federal programs. Next slide. So the signature opportunity that I really want to talk about today, and there's a lot to say about this, there's entire presentations on this, but if you learn nothing else from my presentation, it's that there's this historic opportunity right now happening at this very moment for you to tap into Federal Rescue Plan Act funding at the county level and the municipal level. $2.8 billion went to every county in Pennsylvania, spread across every county in Pennsylvania, and collectively municipalities received $3.3 billion. And those funds are now available. They are currently being allocated or planned for allocation across the major categories that you can see there, from public health expenditures to economic impacts to investment in infrastructure. But the important thing to know from a conservation perspective is that within those categories, there is broad discretion on how that funding is allocated. And although the guidance on this is very complicated from the US Treasury, it is also very clear that things like maintenance of existing parks and trails and open space and the creation of new assets are eligible ways to use this Rescue Act funding, particularly in those underserved areas or to serve vulnerable populations who don't have access to recreation now and may have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID pandemic. It's also eligible for communities to make direct allocations to nonprofit and for-profit businesses that are doing conservation and recreation. This ranges across the entire spectrum of organizations, from heritage areas to conservation landscapes, nonprofit organizations that are doing land conservation, recreational programming, watershed organizations are all eligible to receive funding to do their work and to do expanded work in response to the pandemic. as well as competitive grant programs that counties and municipalities can create and then invite organizations to apply. Clinton County, for example, is doing a program right now that allows communities to apply for funding to do nature-based placemaking and recreational improvements. The great thing about this program is that decisions are made locally. They're made by your local borough council or borough manager, your county commissioners, your township supervisors. And so that's what really makes this the best chance you have to get federal funding via your local government for some of these priorities that you have. And so there's a lot more to say on this. If you're interested in it, go to We Can Serve PA's website and you can find information on ARPA, or you can reach out to DCNR or to me and we can provide even more detail on this. But if you have not heard of this before, it is an opportunity that you should take advantage of. Next slide, please. And we shouldn't neglect that there's also significant state funding opportunities from all the organizations and agencies that we know well. There is the potential for enhanced funding that I think you'll be hearing about through some of the federal or some of the state legislation that will take ARPA and allow us to do more through our state agencies around conservation and the environment. But it's also important to keep in mind that if you're able to leverage ARPA funding locally, that is federal funding that can match all of these state agency funding. So it's this opportunity that small communities that typically struggle to supply 50% or 20% match for a program to have federal funding in hand that can provide that match. And obviously, each one of these agencies has great guidance on all the different programs they have together. But I just want to show you the range of agencies that are engaged with this kind of work, from DCNR to PHMC and everything in between, that you should be considering as ways to fund your local priorities. And the great thing about those programs is that even within programs that are set up for things like public health or transportation, there are programs that can fund things like trails and open space. And again, the most competitive way to structure a project is many of the things that you heard from Becky, where you can take a project that might be about transportation, but also layer on stormwater benefits, public health benefits, equity benefits, to position your project to engage multiple agencies and funding streams, but also to make a more compelling case for why your project's impactful. The best way to demonstrate that is to tie these local projects into your local and regional plans, back them up with data, especially data around economic benefits, public health benefits, and some of that return on environment data that you saw earlier, but also match that up with qualitative analysis that talks from a personal level and a human level about why these projects are important. I would encourage you to think about collaborating with new and unconventional partners. If you're a recreation program, you should be thinking about the implications for public health, to your economy, and thinking through who the partners are that care about those things and bringing them to the table as well. And of course, building your equity goals into your project and being very explicit about the positive benefits that your project will bring, and using that to entice state funding into your project. And then the next slide is very broad brush in the sense of reminding you that there are federal opportunities out there right now. I think that this conversation gets very convoluted. There are literally tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into federal programs right now, both through the Rescue Plan Act and through the IIJA, the big infrastructure bill. But many of those programs are going to be extremely competitive. They are through the EDA, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and others, and they will have billions of dollars available, but obviously there's only so many projects they can fund. If your community is a really good fit for something very competitive, it's worth the effort to go after it, because unlike some of our state funding sources that might be a couple $100,000, maybe at the maximum a couple $1 million, these programs are tens of millions of dollars, up to $100 million or more in some cases. But obviously with that larger funding amount comes the competitiveness and the need probably to expend some funding up front on consultants and additional analysis to be able to apply for funding. Just two very quick examples up in the Pennsylvania wilds, where they just do incredible work tying together the outdoor economy and the kinds of things we're talking about. They are a finalist for the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, working on the cluster of outdoor recreation industry partners that they have spread across multiple counties of the northern tier. And that is, gives them the potential to receive up to $100 million to support their work. So incredibly transformational if they were to get it. But even the work that they're going through right now to align their industry and talk about their industry in the PA Wilds is transforming the way that we think about the outdoor economy in Pennsylvania. So there's a great example of a region where it made perfect sense to go after very competitive funding. And then here in York County, through the U.S. Department of Transportation's RAISE grants, we're applying for $15 million to the Codorus Greenway project, which DCNR and many other state agencies have supported. So there are opportunities out there, but the best one of all, the parting word I'll give is look at ARPA at a local level and at your county level and try to tap into that funding. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you, Silas. We're going to give you one more opportunity in your closing remarks to hit that point even harder. So now that Silas has reviewed with us, particularly some of the national level funding sources that are available, we'd like to welcome Brad with We Can Serve PA, who's the managing partner of the Growing Greener Coalition, to talk with us about some of the upcoming state level and other initiatives that could be leveraged for supporting investments in the outdoors moving forward. Brad, it's all you.
Yes, thank you, Nathan, for the introduction. I appreciate that. And I find it interesting that in Silas's previous presentation, he mentioned that each of those funding sources could be their own presentation. Well, I'm going to be focusing most of this on the American Rescue Plan Act, as both avenues in which I'm going to discuss, be the governor's proposal or the legislation, are both finding their funding from the American Rescue Plan Act. So yeah, I'm with We Can Serve PA. We advocate for pro-conservation, life-sustaining government policy, and we also assist individuals and organizations in effectively and efficiently conserving land. So just as an overview of what I'm going to discuss here, so there are a couple terms I'm going to use, the first being growing greener. When I refer to growing greener, that's more of a blanketed term given to the initiative. So conservation funding as a whole, advocating for growing greener. Now, Growing Greener 3 specifically is the third iteration of the Growing Greener program, which the legislation I'll further discuss is advocating for. So to begin with, the governor in his budget proposal in February of this year, as can be assumed, it was heavily focused on the pandemic and remediation of damages caused by the pandemic. He even conceded that there was an increase in outdoor recreational usage due to the pandemic. And he said, and I quote, "They used our parks, they want to be outdoors, they want a clean environment. Those things were important during the pandemic, and I think we learned how important they really are to Pennsylvanians." So to go off of that assertion from him, he proposed a $450 million deposit from the American Rescue Plan Act for outdoor conservation and recreation. So he clearly finds an importance as a result of the pandemic to bolster state conservation funding, and has proposed the $450 million from the American Rescue Plan Act. Now, to go off of that, there are currently two bills that we're really heavily advocating for. The first being Senate Bill 525 from Senator Gordner, and the second being House Bill 2020 from Representative Culver. Now, both of these have been given the nickname that I previously mentioned, Growing Greener 3, since this would be the third iteration of a large amount of funding being put into the Environmental Stewardship Fund. Now, both of these bills are identical in nature. They're both asking for $500 million from the American Rescue Plan Act for clean water conservation, acid mine drainage cleanup, and just other conservation efforts. To further break them down, each bill asks for 45% of that funding to be allocated to the DCNR for outdoor recreation and conservation projects, 40% of the funding to be allocated primarily for acid mine drainage cleanup to the DEP and for additional watershed protection, and then the residual 15% to the Department of Agriculture for farmland preservation and infrastructure upgrades. So as it stands right now, the two main focuses we're pushing for: the governor's proposal of the $450 million and the two pieces of legislation, Senate Bill 525 and House Bill 2020, that's asking for the $500 million. Now, as we've looked at them, to build upon them, the budget proposal and the legislation, We Conserve PA commissioned a private law firm to do a review of the American Rescue Plan fund usage, just to get some confidence in the legality of using these funds for these projects. And the review, they found 3 distinct usages of this funding for growing greener initiatives. So the first of those are investments to improve outdoor spaces for healthier living. That could come in the form of parks, other outdoor recreational spaces, or one that's actually interesting, they really hammered heavily, was restaurant and bar infrastructure. So I'm sure, as we all know, the pandemic, there was a lot of outdoor seating, and restaurants are kind of expanding their locales to accommodate during the pandemic. So that's one of the usages that they mentioned. The second distinct usage was for environmental remediation. So just remedying outdated environmental resources and facilities, as Pennsylvanians have really used outdoor spaces over the last 2 years at a higher rate, things have degraded even quicker too. So this funding could go to offset any of that remediation that is needed. And the final point is green infrastructure projects. And they equated that to projects similar to the EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So stormwater infrastructure, water conservation, efficiency, and reuse. And one thing that is actually interesting, this morning, I was meeting with Representative Webster from Montgomery County. And as unfortunate as this is, in his district that he knows of so far last year during our high periods of rain, there are so far 45 homes that have been condemned based on the increase of flooding coming from municipalities up the way down into his area. So a lot of this funding, as unfortunate as it is, it's needed. There are real world applications that are needed and needed quick. So just as a little recap, there's the governor's proposal of $450 million. There are the 2 pieces of legislation for asking for the $500 million. And then, there was the legal review that we did that kind of confirmed the usage of this money. So, successful conservation requires this funding, and these funding streams really serve as the groundwork for the return on these investments. And I know, as Silas mentioned a few times, this truly is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get this amount of funding into this pot. It's something that doesn't incur any kind of debt later down the road. It's just reallocating funds that were given to Pennsylvanians for the benefit of Pennsylvanians that shouldn't sit in a rainy day fund. And I do want to mention that though Growing Greener 3 is our primary focus right now, as well as a proposal, we advocate for state conservation no matter what the funding source is, be it Growing Greener 3, the proposal from the governor, or any new avenues. So we also recognize that our advocacy efforts here are strong, but what really works and what really gets legislators motivated is participation for Pennsylvanians throughout the state. So we just really want to encourage you and your organizations to reach out to your senators and your representatives and really express to them how important this conservation funding is to you guys. So with that, I'll turn it back over.
Thank you very much, Brad. Your remarks are appreciated. I'd like to welcome all of our panelists back to the virtual table here, and I'd like to also welcome any of our attendees, CNRAC members, others who are participating today, to use the Q&A function to submit questions that you have, and we'll get to them to the best of our abilities. The first question that I have for our panelists, and I suppose I'll direct it to, of course, to all of our panelists, but maybe to Silas and Becky to begin with. You're working at the community level. If you were to give a piece of advice to a municipality or a regional planning group that is new to this initiative about how to get started, what would your advice be on entry points and first steps, ways to score early wins and build momentum?
You want to go first, Silas, or?
I'll take a stab at it, and then you can give the more artful answer, Becky. I would say just one general piece of advice and observation is that many of us who care about trails, parks, open space, recreation, and maybe this is starting to change, don't think of ourselves, even though we talk about it, as genuine parts of the economy, and we don't see ourselves sitting at the same table as our business leadership in the community, our larger corporations. And part of that is we're not always invited to those tables. But I would say if there is any advice, it is truly broaden your network of people who are aware of your project and understand its benefits, and include your business community and your civic leadership, obviously. Because for better or worse, that is the pathway to getting significant funding and significant buy-in for your projects. And you can do that in a very authentic way that doesn't mean turning away from all your supporters, the reasons why you care about your project, but just makes that table a little bit bigger for people who can help open up doors for you. And I think Becky's projects show how that works well.
Silas is spot on. And I would just add that it's really important not to just go to people that you want things from all the time. Engage in things like our Greater Lehigh Valley Chamber of Commerce has an Energy and Environment Committee. They meet monthly. DCNR has the Conservation Landscapes Program, Lehigh Valley Greenways. We meet a lot virtually now, but are trying to do some more in person. And we've spun off the Link Trail Partnership out of that because we realized we needed an implementation arm to get some of those cross-sector partnerships together to get things done. But you have to be at the table and committed. Even if you're showing up to a table where nobody knows you, people are genuinely interested in this work. I mean, all the data that everybody's shown and the value of what all of the work that all of us are doing provides is basically undeniable. We have all the fact-based optimism we could get. So how do you put that together? And I think then contributing in other ways beyond your own project and your own fundraising builds that trust that allows you to do the bigger things.
Yeah, Tim, go for it, please.
Speaking from the local level, we like to see that a more universal recognition that the problems that communities have can be at least part and solved by parks and recreation, because everything that's important in the community is touched by Parks and Rec. I mean, when you talk about health and wellness, environmental sustainability, social equity, economic stimulation, infrastructure and resiliency, people development, community livability, and oh yeah, also recreation and leisure. All these things are touched by what we do in the communities. And when people understand that these services are solving problems, they're more likely to be brought to the table when we're talking about them and when we're planning on how to address them.
Excellent. Your comments there, Tim, lead directly to the next question that I have for you, and it grows out partially from a sensitivity that I have. You know that my position in DCNR is new, and I'm trying to figure out how am I doing a good job, and I want to measure my success and I want to be able to communicate that. And Tim, I just heard you talk about the ways that investments in the outdoors can be successful. And so my question to you on the panel is, we have this once in a generation or once in a lifetime opportunity right now to revisit the CCC and Goddard era, and now whatever we're going to call this era in investment in the outdoors. 5 years from now, 25 years from now, how will we know we'll be successful? What evidence will we be able to see? What should we be measuring now, both on the quantitative, as Silas highlighted, having the quantitative data to support this, and the qualitative, the lived experience. So if you were gonna start building the case now so that we know we reach success 5 or 25 years from now, what would you advise?
Well, I would start with all those same things that we feel are important in our quality of life and community living. And in 5 and 10 and so on years, have we grown our community more resilient? Are we more environmentally sustainable in our buildings and our streetscapes and our connections to nature and so on? It's not an easy lift. Obviously, it connects to everything that we do, and obviously takes a lot of funding to bring it there. We had found from our Conservation and Leadership Summit a couple of years ago that funding, of course, is the #1 issue all the time, but then so is diversity issues and equity among our people groups, and public advocacy. One of the things we found in our recent survey, what makes a difference in the local level is the level of vocal advocacy, people speaking up on behalf of what they want to see in their towns, and the relationships that are built between the financial decision makers and the people that are engaging in our parks and outdoor resources. So that's a start. That's no final answer. I'm eager to hear other aspects from the other panelists to add to that.
I'd be happy to add my thoughts on that as well. I think that part of how we would define success is if we've addressed the backlogs that exist both in community recreation as well in our state parks and state forests, and not just have gotten those, not just completing those projects, but having a sustainable funding model so that, in 25 years, we've addressed most of them, but in 25 years, we're back to, having a large deficit or a large need for investment in maintenance and infrastructure. Because oftentimes when budgets get tight, it's the recreation, it's the investment into the outdoors that is the first to be sliced. And so I think that it goes back to, if we're successful, we'll be able to, decision makers will recognize it's important to continue to invest in these places in the landscape, even when finances are tight. And I agree too with you, Tim, in that if we have more people being vocal about how important these places in the landscape are for their lives, and that we have more equity in access so that everybody can access the outdoors without having to drive, within a few minutes and safely. That would be, to me, another sign of success.
This is going to maybe sound like a funny answer, but I've been watching a lot of political campaigns on TV and their ads, and I would think a great bellwether would be, are people touting the outdoors in the same way that now they tout much less impactful industries? So the whole conversation about natural gas in Pennsylvania, we have entire parts of our state government, and just go off the rails for a second, entire sections of our state government devoted to facilitating the exploration of gas and making that as easy as possible. And yet it's a sector that is much smaller than outdoor recreation in Pennsylvania. And so I think the true test will be, do we have the infrastructure within state government, the nonprofit sector, that recognizes that we have whether it's an $18 billion industry, a $30 billion industry, in 20 years, $100 billion industry, do we actually reflect that in our priorities and how we allocate resources, both in state government and in our our nonprofit sector, our philanthropic sector, because right now we put a disproportionate amount of resources into industries that have very little economic impact and obviously are extractive in a way that outdoor recreation and its associated sector aren't.
Here.
You're singing the gospel, Silas. Thank you. Carolyn, did you have something?
Yes. Well, I also wanted to open this up. We have a number of our CNRAC members who are participating, who are listening in. If they have any questions, chime in after me. All you have to do is unmute your button, and you'll be fine if you want to put your video on. But just to build on what Tim was saying and Marcy, from an advocacy standpoint, both at the local level and the state level, is there anything specific you would recommend for people that are recreation users or in their local community, what we can do to encourage our municipalities to get more engaged or to make them aware of these things? Is there anything that any of you as panelists would recommend for us back home that we should be doing to help further things?
So I can take this one. So one thing that we have is We Can Serve PA and the Growing Greener Coalition. We have resources online. If you go to the Growing Greener Coalition website or the Environmental Stewardship Fund or the Keystone Parks and Recreation Fund, you can actually find interactive maps on there that can overlay with projects that happen in your municipalities or even in your own backyard. So you can kind of get an understanding of, okay, I hear of these things going on, but now I can see tangibly what has impacted my community. Contact your municipality, have a conversation about it. And as I mentioned before, like, hey, a lot of this can't get done unless our representatives and our senators don't, advocate for this funding as well. Let's give them a call. Let's call them up, thank them for what they've done, and also encourage them to continue bolstering this conservation funding that has so graciously impacted our communities. So actually having the ability to look at projects and see what's been done in your community, I think, is a good way for, average everyday people to get involved.
And is there anything specific, Brad, with Senate Bill 525 or House Bill 2020 that you need people to be doing at this time? Or are we still in a holding pattern, or what do you see a role, if any, there?
So the biggest thing is still just pushing for grassroots advocacy. Senate Bill 525 is passed second consideration and is sitting with the Appropriations Committee, and 2020 was just introduced and it's sitting in the ERE. So 525 is a bit further along, but I mean, the more that they keep hearing about it and the more they keep hearing, if they hear growing greener, they know what that is. Every time I've mentioned it, it's like their heads kind of turn. So if they hear the phrase growing greener, they're going to know exactly what you're talking about. So just making yourself known and making your voice heard is going to make the biggest impact.
Great.
And Geraldine, I would add that, we're still trying to get sponsors on those bills. So they can look at the sponsorship online and see, if their representative is on 2020 or their senator on 525 and have a conversation with them, because we're going to need, the support of a majority of the General Assembly in order to move these bills forward. I would also say letters to the editor are good. Let it be known, start a conversation, take your elected officials out to see what some of these needs are, what could benefit from investment. And PPFF does legislative tours of state parks and state forests. Join a tour, meet up with your local municipality and have conversations. It's really important for them to see how this money is spent on the ground and what it can do for their legislative districts and understand the impact that it can have.
I think building off of that, what Silas said is oftentimes people think of parks as not necessary. A number of people have said that. We know that's not true. So what is your other angle or your other angles? Is this part of the transportation system? Is this a way to mitigate flooding because you're improving riparian buffers and making sure that those waterways and floodplains are protected from further development? What are all of your angles? And talking to your elected officials about the global benefits of why this works. And then another thing I think is we have an unprecedented opportunity because of the COVID-19 pandemic, where everyone was talking about public health. To leverage those outdoor resources is part of the pandemic resiliency conversation. We cannot let that go. It's our once in a lifetime opportunity, hopefully, out of an otherwise bad situation. Hopefully there's not more pandemics, but you have to find that silver lining, and COVID-19 gave us that. So leverage it, and people are now willing to prioritize health in ways that they haven't before. So if the person you need to lead off with has a health priority, make that your lead off statement. Know who you're talking to, especially to support the advancement of some of these actions by the legislature or other legislative bodies.
Thank you very much. We're approaching the end of our time. I don't think we're going to have time to do a speed round of closing arguments. So I hope that the panelists, feel satisfied with the way that they were able to make their points in the remarks. We do have one remaining question, and it's an interesting question in the Q&A box. I'll read it right now, and I very much wonder if we have anything to respond to with this. With ARPA funding, creation of new assets for underserved communities being on the table and an emphasis, is anyone familiar with these funds being used to preserve lands for Indigenous communities or connecting with Indigenous communities in the Commonwealth? And part of
I'm not aware of Indigenous communities, but I know what we're doing is we've created a whole equity analysis of the Lehigh Valley, including 14 different data sets, and we're in the process of adding more of that. So we know where the least equitable, most equitable places are in the region. And then we adopted, as part of the regional plan, a requirement that we will address areas of the highest inequity first. And so I think there's, especially the Department of Environmental Protection has done a lot on environmental issues related, and environmental justice issues related to equity communities. So if we continue as the state, as regions, as local governments to prioritize these equity issues, then that should go a long way to starting to address lack of parks and recreation facilities, environmental contamination, and other things that are affecting people who are underserved.
And I would just add that in the guidelines for ARPA, if you're looking at this from a county or municipal level, there are very specific ways that they define qualified census tracts and equity within those guidelines. But then they say very clearly that you have the discretion locally to identify other vulnerable populations. So if you're in a part of Pennsylvania that has an Indigenous population and you feel that they've suffered disproportionate impacts during the pandemic or have been historically disadvantaged, as long as you can document that and you have a good rationale behind it, you can identify them as a vulnerable population that should receive ARPA funding for, certain types of support. So I wouldn't feel like the guidelines are so strict that you can't do that, even if we don't have any great case studies to share today.
And DEP does have an online portal, I believe, that follows those guidelines, by the way, that you can use with abandon to support your applications as well. And I apologize, I don't have that website in front of me, but I'm sure someone could make that available.
Yeah, we did get another question in from one of our CNRAC members that was saying the Lehigh Valley work provides a great model and example. Is there a resource such as a website which tells the complete Lehigh Valley story in terms of what you've achieved and how, what worked, what didn't? Are there other regions of the Commonwealth where this story could be repeated? She's from the Pittsburgh area, like near, a major city like Pittsburgh. Is it scalable? That it could work for a smaller, less populated region?
Yes, everything that we do is on lvpc.org. Now, the one thing that question really got me thinking about is we necessarily, not until today, did I kind of put the narrative together as part of the PowerPoint. But what we do, and I want to say thank you for the question because it's encouraging me to do just that. And I will definitely prioritize that follow-up. But our philosophy is everything's a puzzle piece. Nothing we do lives in isolation. So everything we do should lead to more. And so the next thing we do will be a puzzle piece that needs to fit in with the rest of the puzzle. And I've just got to put pen to paper on that a little bit better and really think through how it can be scalable. Yes, these things are scalable. We work on a regional scale, but the people who implement a lot of what we do are boroughs, rural communities, heavily suburban communities and cities. So we have to make it scalable. And so I'll definitely want to thank, I think it's Meredith Graham who asked that question, because I'm going to follow up on that. And I hope that it's a good chance for me to get to know you a little bit better too, Meredith, because I think you could be of help with that. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and our attendees for your thoughts and enthusiasm today. And with that, I'll turn things back over to Geraldine.
All right. Thank you, Nathan. And thank you all so much. This was excellent. There was just great discussion on so many things. We could be here all day and then some, I think, if we had the time. And just want to say, as I mentioned, it will be recorded. So if there's something you want to go back to see, just look at the DCNR website, and it usually takes about a week or so for that to appear. The other thing I just want to acknowledge is that there are a number of council members joining us, and I just would like to run through very quickly who they are. We have Bob Kirshner, who's our vice chair, Meredith Graham, who's our secretary, Dave Trimpe, Matt Gabler, Rocco Ally, Sarah Hall Bedonius, Silas is with us, Greg Goldman, and Jerry Walls. And I don't know if I missed anyone. I think I got everyone from there. So just want to thank you all very much for joining in as well. And if we can help in any way with just connections or passing on information, please keep CNRAC in mind. These conversations have been very, very beneficial to a lot of folks, including us as well. So hopefully we can keep the discussion going. So Nathan, thank you as well for a great job moderating today.
My pleasure, anytime.
Okay, well, with that, take care and thanks again. Have a great day.